There are things a person does not understand until the cold teaches them. I did not understand, in November of 1873, that the morning Harlan Voss set my trunk on the porch and said the words he said would be the last morning I ever spent without warmth enough to last the night. I did not understand that the ground he was sending me away from, the ground I had watched my father work for 30 years, was not the curse it looked like in the gray light before the first snow. I did not understand any of it yet. I only understood that the trunk was on the porch, and that Harlan's second wife was already inside by the stove, and that I had until midday to be off the property he had taken in the settlement. That is where this story begins. Not in the cold exactly, though the cold is what shaped it. It begins on the Voss property line in Harlan County, Kentucky, on the 2nd of November, 1873, with a woman named Clara Stell, 31 years old, standing beside her own trunk in the gray morning air, watching her husband of 9 years walk back through the door he had built with her father's lumber. The neighbors called what I carried with me that day almost nothing. What the neighbors could not see was that almost nothing was enough. What I carried in that trunk was my father's hand, though my father had been dead 4 years. It was his knowledge of the ground, the way he had read the earth of this county, the way other men read a ledger, and the one lesson he had given me the winter before he went, kneeling in the hollow behind the smokehouse and pressing his palm flat to the soil and telling me what lived there. I did not know, standing at that property line, that everything I needed to survive the winter that was coming had already been given to me. But if you have stayed this long, stay a while longer, because what Clara Stell built in the 60 days between that November morning and the first hard freeze of December will not let you go. My father's name was Amos Red, and he had worked the hillside ground of Harlan County since before I could remember. He was not a man given to large statements. He said little at the table and less in the field, and what passed between us was mostly the language of tools and soil, and the rhythm of one body watching another body work. He could identify the county's soil changes by the color of the subsoil and the behavior of the roots when he turned the ground in spring, and he could tell from the drainage of a slope and the way the grasses grew at the edge of the timberline whether a piece of ground would hold moisture through a dry August or lose it before the end of July. He had no schooling in any of this. He had watched his own father work, and his father before him had watched someone else, and the knowledge had come down through hands and not through pages, which is perhaps why he was deliberate about passing it. A page can be lost in a fire or left in a house a man walks out of. A hand remembers what it has done. But the winter before he died, something changed in him, and he became deliberate in a way that frightened me a little, the way a man becomes deliberate when he has begun to settle accounts. He took me to the hollow behind the smokehouse on a Sunday afternoon and knelt in the frozen ground and dug down with his bare fingers until he had a fistful of the dark earth that lived below the frost line, and he held it toward me in his cupped hands like a gift. His hands were large and rough-knuckled, the color of the soil they had spent their life in, and I remember the specific look of that dark earth against them, the way the two browns were almost the same brown, but not quite. He said the ground does not freeze at 12 inches if you pack the walls right. He said a body underground stays warm on 2 cords of wood when a body above ground burns 4. He said the hill holds heat the way a root cellar holds cold, if you cut into it correctly, if you brace the ceiling with the right timber and leave the right angle at the entry so the wind does not find its way down. He had done it once, he said, when he was a young man in Virginia, before the family came west, and the family had survived a February that killed 8 of their neighbors' cattle. and 2 of their neighbors' children. He said the room had not been large, only a single chamber dug into the south-facing bank behind the barn, with a clay hearth at the back and a roof of oak shingles under 2 feet of packed earth, and that when the February wind came north at 15 below, they had sat in that room with the fire burning moderate and been warmer than the men in the proper houses at the edge of town. He said he had never needed it again, but that knowing it was like carrying a key to a door you hoped never to find, because finding the door meant you were already in trouble. Then he set the dark earth back in its place and smoothed it with his hands, and stood up, and we walked back to the house, and he died the following March without speaking of it again. I thought of that Sunday every day of the 11 months I spent inside Harlan Voss's house after my father's death, when Harlan was working the land my father had left and spending my father's savings on the new house timbers and paying the old debts with the money that had been set aside for seed. I thought of it when the settlement came through and the magistrate read the terms, and Harlan's face held no expression at all, and I understood that the savings were gone, and the land was his, and what I had was the right to remove myself from the property before snow. I thought of my father's hands in the dirt, and I thought, he knew. He did not know Harlan Voss, but he knew the door, and he put the key in my hands. I carried the trunk half a mile west along the ridge road to the parcel my father had kept separate from the main property. 15 acres of hillside ground too rocky to farm and too steep for cattle, which had gone to me in the settlement because Harlan did not want it. 15 acres of slope and limestone outcrop, and a hollow behind the far ridgeline where the dark soil ran deep. A neighbor named Tuft, passing me on his wagon that morning, slowed his horse and looked at the trunk in the direction I was walking, and said, without cruelty, but with the particular pity of a man who has already decided a thing, that there was nothing on that hill but rock and cold. I told him I was warm enough for now. He didn't answer that. He clicked his horse on down the road. The first thing I did was walk the hollow my father had shown me, not the one behind the smokehouse, which belonged to Harlan now, but the corresponding hollow on my 15 acres, on the north-facing slope where the limestone dropped away and a long shoulder of hillside rose behind it. My father had pointed it out to me once, years before, in passing, the way he pointed out soil features as we walked, without explanation, only the point of his finger, and then silence. Now I understood the pointing. The ground there was sheltered from the northwest wind by the rise of the hill, and deep enough into the slope that the first 6 feet of earth above any room you cut would be solid consolidated soil, not topsoil, the dense packed kind that does not give heat up to the air above it easily. There was limestone close to the surface on one edge, which meant a natural wall, and a fall of mature oak along the east side, which meant timber. I began digging on the 3rd of November. I had the spade and the wide blade odds from the trunk, my father's tools, both of them worn to their handles in the way of tools that have been used the way they were made to be used. The spade handle darkened to the color of old honey from 30 years of his grip, the adze edge reground so many times the blade had narrowed by a thumb's width and still cut clean. I had the memory of his hands in the dirt, and I had 31 years of watching a man who understood the ground. I cut down into the hillside at the angle he had described, not vertical but on a shallow drop, so the entry passage ran into the earth at a slant that would break the direct line of wind without blocking the draw of the flue. The passage was 3 feet wide and 6 feet long enough that a person entering had to commit to the direction of the hill before they reached the door, which meant the wind had to commit to that direction too, and wind does not commit to directions easily. I cut the main chamber 7 feet wide and 9 feet deep and 6 feet tall at the crown, higher at the center than at the walls, so the ceiling would distribute load rather than carry it flat. This took 9 days, working 6 hours in the daylight, and the soil was good to me. The dense, packed clay that my father had spoken of, the kind that holds the shape of a cut without crumbling and packs back tight against the oak supports without air gaps. I moved something near 40 cubic feet of earth in those 9 days, carrying it out in the wooden bucket I had brought in the trunk and spreading it along the east face of the hill in the shade of the oak line where it would not be seen from the road. I shored the walls with split oak, rough-fitted, the gaps packed with clay and dry grass. I set the roof timbers from the living ridge behind me, short spans so no single beam carried more than its share, and I laid split shingles of oak across them, and then 2 feet of the hill's own earth back on top, tamped down in layers with the back of the spade, each layer wet enough to compact and dry enough to hold. The door I set at the angle my father had described, north of true entry, so that a man standing in the doorway would have his back to the hill, and the cold air would spill past him rather than straight down the passage. The flue was the part that required the most judgment, because the principle is simple, but the execution is not. You must run the vent up through the hill at a long diagonal, far enough from vertical that the heat does not escape straight up, and far enough from horizontal that the smoke does not back down into the chamber. My father had described the angle as like the pitch of a roof in good country, neither flat nor steep, the pitch that sheds rain without fighting the wind. I cut the flue channel with the adze, working blind in the hill, and lined it with clay pressed into the earth walls, and capped it at the surface with a flat limestone slab I had found at the rocky edge of the parcel, set on 4 small stones, so there was a gap for the smoke to escape under the edges without the gap being visible from below. The first time I lit a fire in the clay hearth and watched the smoke clear itself from the room without choking me, I understood that my father's angle was correct. The draw was steady and quiet, the way a good fire draws without labor. By the middle of November, I had a room under the earth. By the 20th, I had a small clay and stone hearth at the back wall, vented through a flue I had run up through the hill at a long diagonal, so the draw would be steady, but the heat would not escape straight up. I had a plank bed, a shelf of rough oak, and a good supply of the split wood I had been cutting from the fallen oak along the eastern edge of the parcel. I had my father's lantern, the tin one, and 6 months' worth of tallow candles, and a sack of cornmeal and dried beans that I had purchased in town on the 4th of November with the last money from the settlement. The people of the town did not know what to make of what I was doing. Word carried the way it carries in a small county, quickly and with the kind of accuracy that gets the outline right and the meaning backwards. By the first week of November, the story was already settled among the people who gathered at the store and the mill. Clara Stell had gone mad from the grief of the settlement, had taken herself out to her father's useless hillside acres, and was digging a hole in the ground like a ground squirrel putting up for winter. A man named Ford Pell, who ran the dry goods and held himself as the county's recorder of common sense, said it plainly on the porch of his store on the 8th of November in front of 6 men and a boy. He said the red girl was making herself a grave before she needed one. I heard this through Bess Drum, who lived on the road between the town and my hillside, and who brought me a jar of preserves and the report together on the 10th, delivered with her face arranged in the careful kindness of a woman who is not sure if she is helping or hurting. I thanked her for both and set the preserves on the shelf and went back to tamping earth on the roof. Ford Pell said it again, with the same words in the same easy tone, on the 22nd of November when I came into his store to purchase another length of rope. He said it to the men on the porch as I came through the door, loud enough that I heard it before I was inside. He said the red girl was at it again, building her grave a little deeper. I paid for the rope and went home. He said it a third time, on the 1st of December with the first light snow already on the ground, when I passed through on my way to the mill. By then the label was the county's settled property, Clara Stell's grave, or sometimes just the grave, spoken with a down curve of the mouth that carried both pity and a kind of smug resignation, the way people speak of a thing they have already filed away as a closed matter. What Ford Pell could not see from his porch was what my father had understood about the hillside ground and what I had put to work in it. He could not see the angle of the entry passage, or the load distribution of the roof timbers, or the long diagonal of the flue. He could not see that the earth above the room was already 2 degrees warmer than the air above the ground, or that on a calm night the small hearth at the back wall would bring the interior to 54 degrees on half a cord of wood, a number I had tested on the 15th of November against the outside temperature of 29 degrees, and found holding. He saw a woman digging in a hillside. He could not see what she was digging toward. My dog was with me through all of it. Her name was Pete, a brown-black hound mix my father had kept, old now and heavy in the joints but steady, and she had come with me from the Voss property on the morning of the trunk, because she had followed my father everywhere, and after his death had transferred that allegiance to me with the complete reliability that is the hound's way. She lay at the entry of the passage while I worked, her chin on her forepaws, watching. And at night she slept at the foot of the plank bed and added her warmth to the room's warmth in the practical way of animals who understand the arithmetic of heat without needing to name it. In the mornings, she would rise before me and sit at the passage entry and look out at the hillside with the settled patience of a creature that has made its peace with cold, because cold is not the only thing there is. The first hard freeze came on the 7th of December. The temperature dropped to 14 degrees by nightfall and to 6 degrees in the early hours of the morning, and I lay in the underground room with Pete at my feet and the hearth burning low in the room at 48 degrees, which was cold enough to want the quilt close, but warm enough to feel the difference between where I was and what was outside the door. I had 2.5 cords of wood under the lean-to I had built against the eastern face of the hill. I estimated on my father's numbers and my own testing that I would not run below 1 cord by March. The county had no such numbers. What happened across Harlan County between the 7th of December, 1873, and the 14th of February, 1874, was the kind of winter that comes to the mountains of eastern Kentucky once in a generation and is afterward used to date other events, the winter before such a thing or after such a thing, the way people use a landmark that does not move. The temperature fell below zero on 18 separate nights. The river froze solid above the ford. 42 head of cattle were lost across 6 farms between the ridge road and the valley floor. 2 of the old men in the county, one living alone, one living with a son whose woodpile ran short, did not survive the January cold. A family of 4 on the north side of the valley burned so much wood, keeping a standard frame house at livable temperature, that they were down to cutting furniture by the 3rd week of January, burning chairs and a sideboard, and finally the parlor floor's 2nd layer of planking to keep from losing their smallest child to the cold. I burned exactly 1 3/4 cords between the 7th of December and the 14th of February. On the coldest night, the night of the 23rd of January, when the temperature outside fell to -11 degrees by the thermometer I had hung at the passage mouth, the interior of the underground room held at 41 degrees on a small fire, and I woke in the night and put 2 more pieces of split oak on the coals, and the room rose to 47 degrees before morning and stayed there. Pete did not stir. The earth above me held what the earth holds, the deep and patient warmth that does not belong to the season, the warmth that my father had known about and had placed, That winter morning 4 years before, in my cupped hands, on the morning of the 14th of February, which was a Saturday, I heard footsteps on the hillside above the entry passage. They were heavy and slow, the footsteps of a large man picking his way through crusted snow, pausing every few steps, which told me he was looking for something, rather than walking toward it. I heard them stop. I heard the long silence of a man standing outside a door he did not understand, a door set into a hillside below a limestone-capped flue vent, invisible from the road, exactly the kind of thing you would not find unless someone had told you to look for it. The thin column of smoke rising from under the limestone would have been the first sign that anything was there at all. I listened to the silence for a long moment. Then I heard Ford Pell's voice, not the porch voice, the easy, confident voice that had carried so far across the storefront on those November mornings, but a quieter one, drained of its usual register, asking if anyone was there. I came out of the passage into the February light, which was pale and sharp and clean after the amber of the underground room, and the cold hit my face with the particular weight of a deep February morning, the kind of cold that is not violent but simply total, everywhere at once, pressing against every exposed surface simultaneously. Ford Pell was standing in the snow at the entry with his felt hat in his hands. He was a large man, red-faced from the cold, and he had the look of a man who had been awake a long time, working toward a difficult thing, the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent days arriving at a decision that cost him something to make. Behind him, at the edge of the clearing where the oak began, was his son Walt, who was 17 and said nothing, and whose face held no expression I could read except the close attention of a young man who understands that something is being decided in his presence that he will carry for a long time. Ford looked at the passage entry, at the neat oak framing of the door, at the thin column of smoke coming up through the hillside from the flue vent under its limestone cap, at the lean-to with its woodpile still substantial under the canvas, at Pete, sitting at my knee in the snow with her chin up and her tail moving slowly. He looked at all of it for a long time, the way a man looks at an arithmetic problem that has come out differently than he expected, and is checking his work. He was doing the accounting that a man of his nature had to do before he could speak, going back through the months and the porch and the label, and what the November mornings had cost me, measuring it against what he was standing in front of now. The smoke rising steady, the woodpile still thick, the dog warm and calm and everything. It was not in the valley below. He looked at me for a moment. The wind moved through the oak branches above us, a sound like water moving. There was no sound from the valley. The cold sat between us, clean and impartial, the same cold that had been inside every house in the county for 10 weeks, the same cold that had taken the 2 old men and the cattle and the furniture from the parlor floor, the same cold that was outside the door of the underground room and was not inside it, and had not been, on any of the 82 nights between December and February, been inside it. He said, quiet and level, "She is warmer than we are." He said it the way a man states a fact he has just finished checking from 3 sides, not an apology and not a declaration, simply the result of the accounting, the plain figure at the bottom of the column. The wind moved again through the oak above us, and Pete pressed her flank against my leg, and I did not say anything, because there was nothing to say, and because the February morning was saying it already, and because my father had been right, and the ground had known it all along, and Ford Pell, standing in the snow with his hat in his hands, was not a victory I needed to announce. Then he said that the family on the north side of the valley needed a place to get their youngest child warm, that the child had not been able to keep heat for 3 days, and that he had come because Bess Drum had told him what she had seen on the hillside, and he had not had a better idea. I brought them in. The youngest child, a girl of 4 named Nell, was wrapped in every piece of cloth her mother owned, and she was cold in the way that frightened me, not shivering but still, and I set her near the hearth and kept Pete beside her because the dog's warmth is reliable and immediate and does not require stoking. The room was 46 degrees when they entered. By the time the child began to sleep naturally, it was 51. They stayed 4 nights. On the second night, 2 more families came, referred by Ford Pell, who had apparently reversed his position with the same decisive efficiency with which he had established it. And by the third night, there were 11 people in a room built for 1, and the temperature held at 44 degrees on a fire, and I fed every 3 hours through the night. 11 people. 2.5 cords remaining when the deep cold broke on the 22nd of February. 1 child who was cold when she arrived and warm when she left, and who grew up to be a schoolteacher in Harlan and lived to be 83 years old, and who told the story to her students every winter, not as a story about Clara Stell exactly, but as a story about the ground and what the ground holds, and the difference between a woman who understood it and the people who did not. The winter broke slowly, the way mountain winters break without apology, the temperature rising a degree a day for 2 weeks before the snow began to come off the hillside in earnest. Ford Pell came back on the 25th of February with his son Walt and 2 other men from the valley, and they stood at the passage entry, and Ford asked me, with his hat in his hands again, if I would walk them through what I had done. I walked them through it. I showed them the angle of the entry, the load distribution of the roof timbers, the clay pack in the wall joints, the diagonal of the flue and why the angle mattered. I told them it had come from my father, who had done it once in Virginia when he was young, and that the principle was simple. The ground at 12 inches does not freeze, and a body underground stays warm on half what a body above ground burns if the walls are right and the ceiling carries its weight correctly. Walt took notes on a piece of paper he had brought folded in his coat pocket. He wrote carefully, in a small hand. Ford watched him write and did not interrupt. By the following November, 3 families in the eastern part of the county had cut earthen rooms into their hillside ground. They had copied the visible form, the entry passage, and the rough oak framing, but 2 of the 3 had not understood the angle, and 1 had set the flue too steep and found the draft irregular. They came back to me one by one across the winter of 1874, and I showed them what they had missed. The angle is not decoration, I told each of them. The angle is what makes the wind pass rather than enter. My father said it once, and I have never found it wrong. By the second winter, the corrections were made, and the method held. Walt Pell carried the notes he had taken into his adult life and eventually into a short account, published in a regional agricultural paper in 1881, which described the earthen room construction in enough detail that farmers in 3 surrounding counties had enough to build from, though the paper called the technique hill sheltering and attributed it to no one by name, only to a practice common in the hill counties of eastern Kentucky, whose origins were older than anyone living could say. Walt knew whose origins they were, and he wrote me a letter after the publication to tell me so. And I kept the letter in my father's tin box alongside the adze handle I had saved when the blade wore out past sharpening, and the small square of paper on which I had written down, in the winter of 1873, the temperature readings I had taken in the passage on the night of -11, because I had wanted to be sure I was not remembering them more favorably than they deserved. I was not. 41 degrees at -11 outside. I had written it down in pencil with the date. Ford Pell did not say much to me after that winter. He was not a man built for extended acts of contrition, and I did not need him to be. He nodded when he saw me in town. He gave me a fair price for goods without the small markup he applied to people he held in low estimation. Once, in the summer of 1876, he told me, in passing, that he had cut a hill room into the back of his own property, and that it had taken him through the previous January with a cord and a half to spare. He said it with no direct acknowledgement of what the source of the knowledge was, only a brief look, and then the conversation moving on. And I understood that this was as close as Ford Pell was going to come to finishing the account he had opened on his porch in November of 1873, and I accepted it for what it was. The 15 rocky acres my father had kept separate were where I stayed. I did not return to the Voss property. I did not seek Harlan out. I had no need to. The settlement had been the settlement, and the law was the law, and the winter had said what the winter had said, and the account was settled in the only ledger that had ever mattered to me, which was the one my father had kept in his hands and passed to mine. I planted the level sections of the hill ground with kitchen garden the first spring, and added a small orchard on the southeast-facing slope in the spring of 1876, apple and cherry, chosen for the altitude and the drainage. The hillside that Tuft had called nothing but rock and cold grew 53 bushels of apple in its best year, which was the year of 1882, and the cherries came into full bearing the year after that. Pete lived until 1880, which was a long life for a dog of her kind, and she died on the plank bed in the underground room on a January night when the temperature outside was 8 degrees and the interior was 53, which seemed to me the right way for her to go. I sat with her for an hour after she was gone, in the warmth my father had taught me to keep, and I thought about the winter of 1873, and the trunk on the porch, and the gray morning, and the ground that had looked like nothing. I thought about what my father had put in my hands, kneeling in the frozen dirt, and how I had not known then what I was being given. The room was warm, and the lantern burned low, and outside the hill held everything it held. I was 64 years old. The winter the last hillside room I built finally settled too deep for comfortable use, and by then I had stopped needing it the way I had in the early years, having added a proper structure over the underground chamber in 1885, with a good stone chimney and 2 above-ground rooms, so that the hill room became a cellar with its original warmth intact, rather than a dwelling, which was as my father had imagined it in the first place. A thing you hoped never to need, because needing it meant you were already in trouble. I never removed the old plank bed or the rough oak shelf. They stayed down there in the dark, the way the knowledge stayed, available, patient, waiting for someone to understand that the ground does not give up its warmth to a season unless you let it. Walt Pell's account in the agricultural paper was reprinted twice, once in 1886 in a broader survey of mountain farming practices, and once in 1894 in a pamphlet on low-cost winter construction distributed by an agricultural extension service out of Lexington. Neither reprinting added to what Walt had written or corrected what he had gotten slightly wrong about the flue angle, and I did not seek a correction because the principle was close enough to carry forward, and close enough was how most knowledge traveled, imperfectly but far enough to be useful. What does not travel imperfectly is the part that lives in the hands, the angle of the entry you can read about and still miss until you have stood at a hillside in a northwest wind and felt what the passage does and does not let through. The ceiling height at the crown you can write down and still build flat until you have reached up in the dark of a finished room and felt where the load is distributed and where it is not. What my father gave me that Sunday afternoon in the hollow was not a set of instructions. It was the feeling of the thing first, the warm, dark earth in the cupped hands, the cold of the season held outside of it, and then the words after, because the words needed somewhere to land before they would stick. The hill rooms spread through the county and beyond it, down into the lower settlements where the winters were less severe, but the poverty was deeper and the wood supply shorter. And in those places the rooms were built smaller and shallower, and the principle was sometimes misunderstood, but the rooms were warm enough to matter, and that was enough. Bess Drum's nephew built one in 1877 on his family's place in the next holler to the south, and Bess told me the following spring that it had been the first winter in her nephew's memory that they had not burned furniture by February, and she said it with her face in the expression of a woman who understands that a thing she could not see when it was being built is a thing she can see now. I told her she was welcome to the knowledge, and that the knowledge was not originally mine. She said she knew that. She had known my father. Nell, the child who had come to the hill room cold in the arms of her mother on that February night, grew up to be a school teacher in Harlan and lived to be 83 years old, and told the story to her students every winter, not as a story about Clara Stell exactly, but as a story about the ground and what the ground holds, and the difference between a woman who understood it and the people who did not. One of her students, a girl named Carrie, who grew up and moved to the northern part of the state, built a root cellar on the same principle in 1911 that her neighbors called excessive and unnecessary, until the January of 1912 came in at 14 below, and she was the only farmstead in the township that did not lose livestock. Carrie said she had learned it in school. She had learned it in school because Nell had not forgotten the warmth, and Nell had not forgotten because warmth, received in the dark of a February night at the age of 4, is not the kind of thing a person forgets. I have been told, by people who were told by people who were told, that the hill rooms of eastern Kentucky are still sometimes called graves by the people who do not know them, and called shelter by the people who do. I have been told that a woman in the next county north built one in the 1920s and lived in it through 3 hard winters without losing a cow or a cord, more than she had planned for, and that when someone asked her where she had learned it, she said she had read something in an old paper, something about the angle of the entry and the weight of the ceiling, something that an old man had taught his daughter in the dark of a root cellar, or a hollow, or some piece of hillside ground that no one else had wanted. That is close enough. That is the way it travels. My father's tin box is in the cellar still on the rough oak shelf he never saw, and that I built in his memory, beside the adze handle and the folded letter from Walt Pell and the penciled temperature readings from the winter of 1873. The box doesn't look like much. Harlan Voss walked past it the morning he set my trunk on the porch, walked past it in the kitchen where it sat on the shelf by the door, and saw nothing in it worth keeping. He was not wrong that there was no money in it. He was wrong about what was there. The difference between those two understandings is what this whole long story comes down to, and I have never found a shorter way to say it. The hill is still there. The oak along the eastern edge has grown in twice in the years since I cut it, which is the way of oaks, patient and doubling, the same trees and not the same trees. The entry passage is grown over at the mouth now, the door long since rotted out, and the oak framing taken by time. But the chamber below is intact, the ceiling holding at the same gentle crown my father described from memory of a Virginia hillside he had not seen in 30 years. The walls still clay-packed and damp in the way of deep soil. The plank bed still there in the dark. The rough oak shelf still beside it. And if you went down there on a January night with a lantern and put your palm flat to the earth of the back wall, you would still feel it, quiet and steady, a degree or two above the ground's cold sleep, the warmth that does not belong to the season, the warmth that a man put in his daughter's hands on a Sunday afternoon in the hollow, because he understood that money goes and land can be taken, and a name can be read in a settlement, and a door can be closed, and a trunk set out, and a woman sent away in November. But what lives in the hands will not be sent away. It holds,